This is going to be our final session of our meeting, and as a guy who had some involvement in the selection of these contributors and in putting this conference together, I just want to say, first of all, how pleased I am that all of you have come and for your questions that have been very helpful, and also how pleased I am with all of the contributors, how well that you have done. And today we come to a panel discussion that we're going to be having. And joining me today up here before you are two of our chapter contributors from our forthcoming book from B&H Academic entitled A Powerful Polity, How God Works in and Through Baptist Churches. Both of these panelists are executive directors of Southern Baptist State Conventions. Both are also native sons of the state of Louisiana. I'll take a moment to introduce each of them to you. Really, only a few people in Southern Baptist life can say that they have served as the executive director of a state convention, but to my knowledge, only one living person can say that he is the only executive director that his state convention has ever had. Dr. Jim Richards grew up in North Louisiana, has served in my home state of Arkansas, and has led the Southern Baptist of Texas Convention from its infancy to become a convention of more than 2,500 churches. He's a former vice president of the SBC, a distinguished alumnus both of Mid-America Baptist Theological Seminary and this seminary, the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. Although you may get confused if you go to Amazon, he is not the Dr. Jim Richards who has authored Moving Your Invisible Boundaries, Heart Physics, The Key to Limitless Living. There is another Jim Richards who is the author of that. He is, nonetheless, the author of several books, including Revelation, The Best Is Yet to Come, Encouraging Words for Difficult Days, Embracing the Ends of the Earth, and Contributions to the Mission of Today's Church and Message for the Journey. In this book, in A Powerful Polity, How God Works in and Through Baptist Churches, Dr. Richards has contributed to the area of intercongregational polity. I first came to know Dr. Barrett Duke through his work at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. That's not the beginning of his story, and it's not the end of his story, but it's the beginning of our story. I first encountered him when he was working there. He was in charge of, he was the vice president for public policy and research. But he is presently the executive director, treasurer of the Montana Southern Baptist Convention. And by the way, if any of you feel any inkling toward church planting, he would love to talk to you about how you can come and do that in Big Sky Country. I want to tell you something that you cannot learn about Dr. Duke on LinkedIn. I want to tell you some things that I've seen about him personally. First of all, I want you to know that his compassion for people who need Christ and are far away from him is compelling and inspirational. And I came to see this in particular at the ERLC with his work leading the charge against sex slavery and pornography. And I think it's fair to say, he hasn't told me this, but I am surmising this, that his upbringing in this part of the world caused him to have a knowledge of and a concern for the victims of these sins from things that he has seen here and have known about. Also, I wanted to mention that directly pertinent to his assignment in A Powerful Polity, he's working in the same chapter with the last author that you heard, John Whitehead, is that Barrett for years worked as a liaison and a guide for the Resolutions Committee of the Southern Baptist Convention. And one of the things that he had responsibility for doing in that is that when crazy, hyperactive preachers like me would come into the Resolutions Committee with all these grandiose theological ideas about things to put into a resolution, to have a voice there to say, let's take a moment and think about what implications this may have for our interaction with the culture and with the government if we adopt this resolution, or if we adopt it saying things just this way. What I'm trying to tell you is this guy has served you well and saved you from calamity that you know not about for years and years and years through his work with the Resolutions Committee at the SBC. And so, very thankful to have both of you. Our session this afternoon will touch upon matters related to their two chapters, to intercongregational polity and to interaction with the civil order. And so I hope that you'll join me in welcoming them. I'll offer this question for response from each of you, and I'll start with Dr. Richards. You can answer this one first, and then the same question to Dr. Duke. Over the course of the past several decades, 3 decades or so, Southern Baptist associations and conventions have given considerable attention to the role of the Baptist faith and message in our intercongregational polity, including recent moves by the SBC Executive Committee to connect general agreement, friendly cooperation with the convention to general agreement with the SBC statement of faith. So what do you see as the appropriate role of a statement of faith in Baptist associationalism? Dr. Richards.
The Baptist Faith and Message 2000 is the faith statement of the Southern Baptist Texas Convention, of which I serve. And in our practical application of that, the churches that affiliate with the Southern Baptist of Texas Convention must affirm that they are in agreement with the BF&M 2000, and any entity, whether it's a children's home or a college or any other type of service ministry, must also be willing to work within the parameters. The Baptist Faith and Message 2000 is a tool, as it is stated in the preamble, is for doctrinal accountability. It gives the parameters in which we can find fellowship. Amos 3:3 says, "Can two walk together unless they agree?" We must find a common boundary by which it defines us, and the importance of having a doctrinal statement, whether it's an association, a state convention, or the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, strangely enough, and it may be a misconception, the Southern Baptist Convention actually is not a confessional fellowship. The Baptist Faith and Message 2000 is only applicable to the entities that have adopted it as their operating basis doctrinally, and that would be all of the SBC entities at this time. But they individually must do that. But in order to be an SBC church, you do not have to affirm the BF&M 2000. Although a recent change to the governing documents of the SBC has made it where friendly cooperation is defined as churches that are generally in agreement with the BF&M. So it has made as close a step toward being a confessional fellowship as the Southern Baptist Convention ever has been. State conventions vary from state to state, but we are a confessional fellowship, and we believe that having the statement of faith enables us to have great confidence in those who teach in schools that we fund, that do ministries and start churches that we fund, and that whenever we have speakers and others who are in our training events and things of that nature, that they will be in agreement. And as you well know, the BF&M has quite wide latitude in a lot of areas. You can be a 5-point Calvinist or not like any points at all. You could be a pre-mill, pre-trib, or you can be an amill, and all fit within the Baptist Faith and Message. We have people who can sign and ascribe and affirm and fit within a lot of those parameters. But on the other hand, there's enough definitive doctrinal statements about the nature of Scripture, about the operation of the local church, especially in this conference, would be of concern and interest. But there are those specificities that are important. And then, of course, being updated in 2000, that the BF&M addressed social issues that were not current in 1963. Thereby, it was necessary for an upgrade or an update of the BF&M. So I believe, and I think Southern Baptists generally agree that it is a good instrument of doctrinal accountability to have the Baptist faith and message.
Dr. Duke, anything that you would like to add into that?
Just what he said. Montana Southern Baptist Convention also expects all of our churches to agree with the Baptist faith and message. If a new congregation wants to join the Montana Southern Baptist Convention, one of the requirements is that they accept and agree to what the Baptist faith and message says. We do believe there are negotiables and there are non-negotiables as part of being able to work together in harmony with one another. The Baptist faith and message does a really good job staying in that non-negotiable space. As Dr. Richards says, it leaves plenty of latitude, and that latitude is not only doctrinal. There's some practical latitude as well. For example, the statement on the church simply says that the church needs to practice some level of congregational rule, congregational democratic decision-making, but it doesn't define how expansive that democratic decision-making needs to be. There's also no statement in there on whether or not you can have divorced deacons or not. We've decided we're not going to break fellowship over that question. So there's not only some doctrinal latitude, there's also some practical latitude. I really think the Baptist faith and message has done a fantastic job identifying that non-negotiable space and leaving things open enough for us to have some differences in agreement on other areas that really don't affect our fellowship and still enable us to continue to work together and accomplish what the Lord's called us to do together.
All right. Keep the microphone, Dr. Duke, because I'd like to ask this question to you. If you could write a one-page memo to every trustee of every entity in Southern Baptist life, what are some major themes that you might emphasize?
Okay. I would tell the trustee to understand that oftentimes the entities consider their most important task is to bring the trustee on board with their desires and their goals. And they need to understand that's part of the effort is to bring that trustee into the sphere to help them understand and buy into the vision and the way that the organization wants to go about accomplishing something. And they need to understand that the members are sending them there not necessarily to buy into the vision of the entity, but to hold the entity accountable for what the churches are expecting. And there's a very, they shouldn't see their role as combative, but they should see that they have a really important role of accountability. They are the accountability group for our entities, and I think they really do need to make sure they understand that role.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Dr. Richards, let's take some time. Let's talk about the local association if we're going to talk about intercongregational cooperation. And I think there's a great opportunity for renewed vision and appreciation and revitalization of the local association. I'm going to ask you this question. Historically, Baptist associations have had credentials committees that have served as the doctrinal gatekeepers for the Southern Baptist Convention. Some of the thornier questions in the recent past and in the looming future for the SBC are questions related to affiliation, efforts to disfellowship errant local churches. Is there an answer to these problems to be found in the local associations? Is there anything that needs to change in local associations to make them more capable of resolving these kind of issues? And if you want to expound on any other ways that you think that that our polity and the state convention and national convention level really depends upon the health of a local association, feel free to do that too.
Well, thank you, Dr. Barber. The local association holds a dear place in my heart. I served as the director of missions, and it was one of my fondest memories of ministry in my almost 50 years of serving the Lord. The local association in many places have fallen on hard times, and that's unfortunate because even though we as Southern Baptists abhor connectionalism, there was a quasi-unspoken connectionalism between the association, the state convention, and the Southern Baptist Convention. It operated as one unit. Obviously, it was voluntary. There was no organic connection between those bodies, but nevertheless, there was a functionality that worked so well when the local association was healthy and carrying out its duties. They have, to some degree, surrendered much of their doctrinal accountability standard in many associations, and because of that, state conventions and the Southern Baptist Convention have now had to come to the forefront and act more aggressively toward errant churches. But if the local association would take their responsibility seriously and set the guard, there was one, this is an anecdotal experience, but nevertheless verifiable. There's one local association in Texas that the DOM boasts to me that they had changed their documents now to where a Lutheran church could participate in their association. Well, they had essentially emasculated their documents to the point that there was no longer that Baptistic difference. They had lowered their standards, and unfortunately, we see all types of weakness in the associational system across Texas and across the Southern Baptist Convention. However, to infuse life back into the association, I think that we speak much of having relationships as the strength of our ability to minister together. What greater way than to build relationships on a local level where you can actually sit down and have coffee and visit with and pray with other pastors and other staff members, and doing that in an associational context would be able to once again revive the health of the local association so that it could perhaps provide more assistance in safeguarding the doctrinal areas. While there's such stylistic differences across the spectrum among churches in the local areas and the local associations, there's still the commonality of our beliefs. And there is also the desperate need of fellowship and encouragement. And so I think that the association still provides a vital place if people will invest themselves in it so that they can get something out of it. And then furthermore, it would assist the state convention and the Southern Baptist Convention where they would no longer have to be the gatekeepers for doctrinal integrity.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Sure, yeah, absolutely.
This is a really important question. In Montana, we've lost all of our associational structure because our directors of missions were all being paid by the North American Mission Board. When the North American Mission Board decided to prioritize evangelism, they had to find that money from someplace. And they found that money by defunding the director of missions positions. I'm all for evangelism. I'm all for North American Mission Board's prioritization of America's great cities. If we lose America's great cities, America's future is bleak. I get that, and I support that. But I can tell you that unless God intervenes in a powerful way, when the dust has settled, the historians will be saying that one of the major factors in the disintegration of the Southern Baptist Convention is the loss of associational structure. Especially in pioneer areas that don't have a deep institutional memory. They haven't been Southern Baptists for generations. And at that associational level, you had somebody who was really close to a group of churches that was able to help infuse that Southern Baptist understanding, Southern Baptist polity, and basic Baptist beliefs into those congregations and begin to create a multi-generational and long-term Southern Baptist congregation. In Montana, a lot of our churches They've been winning people to the Lord. There aren't any Southern Baptists to bring into their congregations. They've been winning Catholics and Lutherans and nothings into their fellowships. There's just no deep Southern Baptist memory. And now in a state that's the fourth largest state in the country, the responsibility for helping those congregations develop that identity has fallen on my state office that has just a handful of employees to cover the entire state. Our churches are longing for that associational relationship again. They're trying to figure out how to do that, but they don't have the money to hire somebody. So they're trying to figure out how to get that done. I really do think that we're going to regret, especially in our pioneer areas. I can't speak for areas that have a deeper Southern Baptist history, but I can tell you we're going to regret the loss of that in our pioneer areas.
Hold on to the microphone and just let me piggyback off of what you've said there. Probably the oldest association in the country is the Philadelphia Baptist Association. There's another little association that makes a claim, but I like the PBA's claim better. If you go back and read the earliest minutes of that association, when churches tried to do polity, and it's one thing to describe it in the abstract, it's another thing to try to apply it to real people in real life situations. And whenever they would reach a point that they didn't know what to do, they would run to the association and say, here's our circumstance, we don't know what to do, what do you guys say that we ought to do? And I'm just curious, in your estimation, how often does that happen today? And are there other ways? Sometimes we talk about local church polity, we'll talk about intercongregational polity as though those are separate buckets. But that's one of the ways that the intercongregational polity assists the local polity of the church. Are there other ways that you can think of that these go together and help each other?
It's a regular occurrence that some congregation, a pastor somewhere in Montana will call our office and say, you know what, we're trying to make a decision here and we don't have enough information to make the decision. Or I've got somebody in my church who wants to pull us in this direction. How do I handle that? There's nobody local that they have a relationship with that the church also knows and can respect as somewhat of an expert that has already developed a prior relationship with them that can come in and kind of help them think through the pros and cons of a potential decision that they're making.
Well, surely in this day and time, there's excellent advice on Facebook. If you just get out there and
there's
ask
all
somebody
kinds of opinions, but how many of those opinions do you want? And that's the value of that associational missionary. That associational missionary knows not only the pastor of the church, that associational missionary knows the leadership, the lay leadership of the church as well, and has worked to establish those relationships before they're needed so that they can come along and leverage those relationships when they're needed. It's really hard to do that from 500 miles away and to develop and maintain those relationships in those churches. So what we're trying to do is we pay a pastor a small amount of money in each region of Montana to at least stay in touch with the pastors on a fairly regular basis, but there is no reach into the church really beyond the pastor. So all those relationships with the lay people that are really important for helping them to work through some of these questions, they're just all being lost. And our churches are looking for guidance. They will call a friend or something like that, but it's a lot harder for them to get the trusted advice that they used to feel like was just right around the corner from them.
I'm curious for either or both of you, or at least one of you, to speak to this question. One of the things local associations used to do was send out what they called circular letters, like at least once a year, maybe in connection with their annual meeting. They'd choose some doctrinal topic and would produce a theological treatise together to circulate among the churches and to articulate a doctrinal position. Local associations just don't do that today, or if they do, it's rare, and I don't see it, in spite of the fact that we still produce manifestos and declarations and petitions and statements and all that sort of thing for online subscription to take this doctrinal position or that doctrinal position. So is Baptist polity at the level of the local association capable of achieving consensus on such matters and taking doctrinal stands together, or at least reasoning about doctrine together with one another? What do you think about why that seems to have gone away, and what that bespeaks about our associations?
Yeah, I don't see very much of that happening. But as I said, we pretty much lost our associational structure.
Yeah.
So I don't really see that much of that happening. But I've been in Southern Baptist life for a while. I haven't seen very much of that in the past either. So by and large, we have kind of lost that at the local level. We still, as you recognize, we do still have some of that happening at the national level, a little bit at the state level. But I think part of it has had to do with the fact that we've done a pretty good job of training our pastors. Our seminaries have done a really good job at training our pastors and helping them distinguish between the negotiables and the non-negotiables, so that there is a fairly good agreement on these major doctrinal issues and a lot of the practical issues as well. There's not quite the need for that local level of interaction like that because we are all connected socially now. So you don't need that local letter to be circulated for congregations still to be aware of certain conversations that are having. So social media, the internet has kind of helped fill that gap a little bit. But I think it is really important for local churches still to be able to get together and talk about the different kinds of things they're addressing in their area. We have that a challenge in that area because oftentimes our pastors aren't seminary trained. Most of these guys are bivocational. They're coming up from their local communities. And they don't have that deep theological training that, for example, a lot of the guys here at New Orleans are getting. In fact, we're working at that. We're working with New Orleans Seminary. We've got 6 guys right now in Montana being in an online program here with New Orleans Seminary through the Caskey Institute here. So we're really grateful for that. Because so many of our guys simply don't bring that with them. So it really depends on the level of training that your pastors bring with them when they come into the pastorate.
I'd like to answer it from a different direction, and that is we have seen such a decline in lay involvement in the church. Those of you who are pastors, you're just happy to get them there every third Sunday, much less to have them involved Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and then be a part of an associational meeting, a state convention meeting, and so forth. Owen Cooper was the last layman elected president of the Southern Baptist Convention in the early 70s, and we have, from that point till today, continued in a precipitous decline in lay involvement. The lay involvement has created such a void in Southern Baptist life that when these manifestos come out, the pastor of a church, and he doesn't have to be a megachurch pastor, it's usually led by that group, but there's Billy Bob at Split Fork Baptist Church that's going to sign that too, and the church has no clue of what he signed, and they have no clue that it's, of even the topics that's being discussed, because the average layperson in the church is uninvolved in Baptist life today. And that is to our detriment, and just as Dr. Duke ably stated about the association being the demise of the Southern Baptist Convention eventually because of its disintegration and disinvolvement, I would go a step further and say one of the reasons the association is not active today is because lay people are not active in the local area, in the local association. So they don't get outside of their church. So when we talk about intercongregational polity, lay people are a key to the survival of Baptists in America as we know it. And we must once again re-engage them in denominational life. And when I say that, I'm not talking about the SBC alone. I'm talking at the ground level, the precinct level, which is the association, to have them attend association meetings, understand what the issues are, and it's not just preacher fights or preacher arguments, but that this is about the church and the churches and involve them.
Both of you, good word. It's the moment you've been waiting for. We're going to turn our attention to the state convention, where both of you are qualified experts. Dr. Richards, the story of the most prominent polity event in the past century of Southern Baptist life, the conservative resurgence. It's a story that's almost told, where the acts and the scenes of the story are related to various annual meetings of the Southern Baptist Convention at the national level. What about the various state conventions? Is the story of the conservative resurgence largely untold, as written works go, at the level of the state convention? And would you dare to categorize different ways that the polity of the various state conventions confronted this epoch and its issues?
Well, first of all, I want to respond to my title, Executive Director. As you know, there are no executives in Baptist life, and you surely don't direct them to do anything. So just to say I work with a state convention. The story of the resurgence in state conventions has largely been untold. And I wrote just a few notes down here from my own memory. State conventions have different requirements for messenger representation. I was a foot soldier in the resurgence in Louisiana a long time ago. I was asked to leave Louisiana College in the early 70s protesting liberalism, and then in the 80s became heavily involved in the actual movement known as the conservative resurgence. So I was about a decade before the resurgence began. And as we began to try to turn Louisiana, the obvious method was to go to the convention with your messengers. The larger membership churches were allowed to have, or churches were allowed to have up to 15 messengers on the state level at that time. I don't know what it is now, but it was in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. And the larger membership churches were more easily filling their 15 messengers. I was pastor at Beth River Baptist Church in Rayville, Louisiana, and it took 3 churches my size to just get to the same messenger number as First Baptist Church, Rayville. Not saying that they voted contrary to what I voted, but just simply saying. And so with that scenario, it was much more difficult for us to carry out the conservative resurgence on a state level than on the national level. This was, and by the way, let me thank God for Louisiana Baptist, who reclaimed Louisiana Baptist Convention for biblical inerrancy. Amen. It was the faithful sacrificial work of the smaller membership churches, along with a few larger churches, that made this happen. And now the executive board, the Baptist Message, and Louisiana College all affirm the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. So the resurgence took place in Louisiana through the faithfulness of God's people, and it does remain untold. And I look forward to one day one of you writing a doctrinal dissertation on how this happened in Louisiana. In Texas, it was a different story. Messenger levels were up to 25 per church. And the state convention rallied institutional loyalists, particularly Baylor alumni, to combat a fundamentalist takeover, put that in quotation marks. For various reasons, the smaller membership churches could never overcome the state convention's organization. And due to that fact, the Southern Baptist of Texas Convention was birthed in 1998. So in that case, the resurgence never took place as we saw it in Louisiana. To varying degrees, we see that in other states. In 2017, just last year, Alabama was confronted with Samford University's approval of a pro-homosexual student organization. So still now 25 years since the conclusion of the SBC resurgence, and there's a state convention that's still grappling with that issue. So there are varying levels and varying degrees across the Southern Baptist Convention and the state conventions where the resurgence has been highly successful, moderately successful, and no pun intended there, or not successful at all. So with that, we understand that the story is still being told on the state level, because it's still being reckoned out. And in pioneer areas, and Dr. Duke can answer for himself, it is a completely different approach as well to what happened during the resurgence. But in the Old South, in the southern states, it is to varying degrees how the conservative resurgence played out among the state conventions.
So occasionally I run into guys who say, well, we don't need a local association, and let's get rid of the state convention, and let's consolidate all 6 of the seminaries into one seminary, and let's merge together the IMB and NAM. And I think to myself, you're going to wind up in a situation where the person who gets on the trusteeship of a board that controls everything in the convention has never served at any level in the convention at all before coming to do that. What role do state conventions play in identifying emerging leaders and decision makers who are coming up in our family of churches? And I'm thinking really in both directions. What role can a state convention play in identifying emerging leaders who are going to wind up at a local church level, maybe come into churches that have a lot of influence in state convention? And then also, to what degree does the state convention play a role in identifying emerging leaders in the national convention level who will come to play a significant role in the Southern Baptist Convention? I'm happy for either of you or both of you to speak to that.
One of the things that we definitely avoid doing at all costs at the Southern Baptist of Texas Convention is trying to place pastors in churches. We have a policy or a practice at our convention that when a church requests resumes, we send multiple numbers. We do not want to ever get to the point where we're trying to place pastors. On the other hand, there are those churches and pastors that obviously match up better, and we try to help those churches with those stylistic issues. But primarily, as far as identifying emerging leaders, personally, I look for someone that the Lord's hands on. I just want to find somebody anointed of God. And if they've got the Lord's Spirit on them and they're winning people to Jesus and they're faithful to their family and they're doing all those things at an early stage in their ministry, and I have some confidence that they have a little track record, then that's the kind of person that I want to invite our Committee on Order of Business to include on the program to lead in prayer, read Scripture, or have some involvement on some level, or serve on some committee to be able to involve them in the life of the convention and expose them to what we do and how we do it. And there used to be a DOM in northeast Louisiana who said that there was so much ignorance there that if it ever got out, it ignorantized the whole world. And I believe that I believe there's a great wealth of ignorance that's among our younger leaders about the worth of intercongregational involvement. And yet once they get involved, they get excited and they want to participate, and they're sold because they see that it's worth it. And so just my personal appraisal of young leaders is I try to find someone that the Lord's hand is on and involve them in every way that I can and help them and encourage them, because the future is now. It's not 20 years from now, and we need those guys. Over 1/4 of our 44-member executive board are people who are under 45 years of age. So we have consistently encouraged our committee on nominations to select folks in that age group. We've done everything we could to encourage our committee to select people who are younger to serve on other committees, and we've had presidents elected who are in that age group of our convention. So we're purposely, intentionally trying to raise up those leaders and involve them.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. Scripture tells us not to lay hands on anyone too soon, right? At the local level, if you have those different organizational structures at the local level, you can kind of help develop leadership at the local level and get them ready for other types of responsibility, like statewide responsibility or national responsibility. And it's an opportunity to help in a maturing process, a growing process, and understanding what it's like to be in some kind of connected relationship with other congregations, and then even beyond that. And the state can help in doing that, in exactly the way Dr. Richards has said, is simply encouraging that group that's responsible for identifying those leadership, filling those leadership positions, to look across the entire convention or the association, identify those men and women in certain situations to take on some additional roles and engage in that maturing process and start to develop our leadership, our next generation of leadership from that associational level and on up. So there's a really important role that's being played, and in some ways being lost because, again, of the loss of the associational structure, where we're not able to kind of have that farm team that we can then look at and see who's developing and who's showing the kinds of maturing and capacity to take on additional roles.
Let me just add one other word. We try to model it at our state convention level. We have two of our director of evangelism and director of pastor church relations are in their 30s. And our director of missions, we had a position that one of our senior staff left our staff and became executive director of the Colorado Baptist Convention, and he was in his 30s. We had to replace him with a 46-year-old geezer, but we're trying to trend younger and model to the churches and to the younger generation that there are young leaders out there capable at that age to step up to the plate and lead. I think Al Mohler was, 34 when he was elected president of Southern Seminary. So I think it's just a matter of finding those guys that can provide that kind of leadership and let them model for others. And that also engages the next generation as well.
I want to skip over a couple of things here and try to wrap up in time that you could ask a question or two, maybe. But let me ask this for Dr. Richards. Sometimes going to the SBC annual meeting, it almost feels like there are two different meetings that are taking place simultaneously. The one in the convention hall and then the one on Twitter and on other social media. And so I'm wondering, what are the potential benefits and pitfalls of having a messenger body with smartphones while we're doing our business together?
Well, when you get to my age, your phone is smarter than you are, so you have a problem there. But if we'd had smartphones during the resurgence, I really think that we would have won more quickly. I think communication, obviously, that's the essential of the tool. You can text someone, you can tweet out something, and all of a sudden you have an entire herd back out of the hallway. I lost the recording secretary's position back in the heated days of the mid-'80s. I think it was maybe it was the late 80s by 4 votes out of 25,000 cast or some such number. And it was because our knucklehead brethren were out in the hallway. If we had had Twitter, we would have gotten the votes in. So I think that the communication tool and being able to get out that type of information and helping people to be involved and educated. On the other hand, it has the danger of miseducation and more wildfire than grass in West Texas. So it can create all types of misinformation that all of a sudden will actually be detrimental to the cause of Christ and to the work of the convention. So it's like any other medium. It's a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways.
Speaking of which, the hashtag for this polity conference is over there on the board. But Dr. Duke, I wonder earlier when Dr. Yarnell was making his presentation, he said something that really engaged you about the nature of the church and the connection of that to tax exemption. I was wondering if you would elaborate on that a little bit more for us. And this is going to be the last question I'm going to pose them, and we've got about 13 minutes left in our time. And so if any of you have a question that you would like to pose, then be thinking about that while he responds to this question. And if you don't want to answer their questions, take a long time in replying.
Yeah, I'll try not to filibuster the question here. I guess I want to hear a question or two from you guys, but I'm not sure. So this is a really important issue, as you heard me interact with it earlier, is not only how government thinks about churches, but how we're prepared to let government think about churches. Right now, the government thinks of tax exemption as federal spending through the tax code. Okay, that's how they look at it. They believe they're doing the churches a favor by not taxing us. And they see that as a loss of revenue. So for them, they're losing revenue, and they have certain expectations for how that lost revenue or that revenue that's allowed to stay in place is actually being used. That's why there's this incredible push to get the churches to adopt certain social agendas, because they believe they're actually helping to subsidize the work of the local church. And if they're doing that, then they think those churches should be engaged in similar practices that they would expect of anybody else that they give money to. We can't let that happen. The church is not simply another social institution. It is not another charitable organization. Now, we organize that way, and we've, as Dr. Whitehead has pointed out, our 501c3 status, we do need that corporate status, but it also brings with it certain kinds of challenges for us as well, because we do then, through that, oftentimes think of ourselves as a charitable organization. The church is a divine institution. Government does not have a power or authority over it, and we cannot allow the government to assume that it does have authority over it. And on this issue of tax exemption, that's exactly what they're trying to do, and we need to continue not to promote ourselves as simply another social charitable institution, but as a church that engages in ministry that benefits society. But that's only part of our mission, and it's important for us to make sure that we continue to press that. I think a lot of our folks don't understand that, and we need to do a lot of work at teaching our own folks what the nature of the church actually is, so that they can continue to maintain this distinction between the church and the state.
Okay, very good. Do any of you have any questions? Yes.
Yeah, this might connect to what you said, Dr. Deuce. I have a question about the, in looking at the New Hampshire Confession and going to the 1925 Baptist Faith and Message on the article, it's called Of Civil Government. And then we moved to 1925, it's titled Of Religious Liberty. Really, it seems like in the 1925 BFM, it's talking about both civil government and religious liberty all in the same article. And then it hasn't been changed since 1925, except for maybe, I think, one word, every church. That's every as opposed to. Is it maybe time for an expansion or clarification of that? And would you see maybe a benefit of breaking those two topics apart, having an article on religious liberty and civil government, not just, like I said, they seem like they're kind of laced together in that article.
Okay, so I need to repeat the question for the video's sake. And so the question observes that the article that we presently have on religious liberty arises out of an article from the old New Hampshire Confession of Faith on civil government, and that really all that's been changed since the 1800s is the title of the article in one word. And so the question is, basically, is that article or any one article sufficient for the present day needs in terms of civil government and religious liberty, or is there a need at the least to revise that article and expand it, or at the most even to create two articles, one on civil government and one on religious liberty?
Clarify, changes from New Hampshire to 1925, but from 1925 to 2000.
25 forward, no changes. Okay, very good.
Well, I'm reluctant to call for another revision for the Baptist Faith and Message, but I have to agree that the question of religious freedom is the great question of our age. Just exactly what space the church will be able to continue to fill without finding itself in conflict with the civil authorities is a really important question that needs to be developed, and our folks need a better understanding of the nature of the church and the right, divine right of the church to engage without civil interference, except, of course, in situations where maybe a religious institution or religious group has done harm to individuals. But the church should be free to operate and get the book that's coming out, and you'll read in the book that's coming out that we also believe that the government is actually responsible to help create space for the church to function freely and without interference. And that would be an area, if maybe we don't develop the statement differently than it is, but that we need to start teaching more on it in our churches, because I agree with Dr. Richards. Most of our lay people in our churches, they're not even thinking about this stuff. In fact, I'm afraid too many of them are just saying, okay, come get us. And I really don't want our church members to simply say, come get us. I would rather they had a little better nuanced position on the importance and their rights as religious people in society than simply saying, okay, you come get us, we'll get our guns.
Yeah. Okay. Another question? Yes, Mark. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to limit this to the local and state level. I want to ask you about the national level. But churches or other institutions that seem to have two competing confessions, such as the Baptist Faith and Message and maybe another one, do you feel like that's appropriate for us? One is more loose, as you said, the Baptist Faith and Message, but the second one seems to tighten it up where the Baptist Faith and Message did not.
So the question is, has to do on the local association level and the state convention level with churches that churches or institutions that the Baptist Faith and Message is one among many doctrinal statements that they affirm, or one among more than one that they affirm. Is that something that is appropriate? How ought we to feel about that?
Well, the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, and I always specify that because that is our statement of faith is the SBTC, and there are other state conventions that don't recognize that version. But it is a minimalist statement. So therefore, if an institution, whether it's a seminary, and I think the seminary here has another operating document, chooses to have a secondary document, and it's not in contradiction, and obviously it's not, with the BF&M, it goes beyond what the BF&M states, then I see no conflict at all. First Baptist Church Dallas has a doctrinal statement that Dr. Criswell drew up that's pre-trib, pre-mill. That obviously is well beyond what the BF&M 2000 would say. Its end-time position is Jesus is coming again. That's about it. So there are churches, there are institutions that will go beyond the BF&M, and as long as it's not contradictory, then I would say that I couldn't see any problem with it.
Here's our last question from Jordan.
Yeah, you talked about conservative resurgence in the state level. I'm curious about associations. I know there's as many varieties as there are DOMs and associations out there, but I hadn't heard stories. Were there new associations formed? Have there been new associations formed over these sorts of issues? Does that happen, or even hearing about, some sort of resurgent new DOM coming in for a local association when that was necessary? Do you have any specific examples or anecdotes about associations changing?
So the question is, how did the conservative resurgence show up at the local associational level? Were there splits? Were there people replaced by other people? Some telling of the story at that level.
And moreover,
And
if a change needs to be made in a local association, what's best for in moving forward, making those changes?
if it hasn't happened yet, what ought you to do?
Yeah, that is a really good question, and probably the conservative resurgence, the last vestige of the moderate holdout was at the associational level. In fact, I think that's why in a lot of our guys there's this anti-associational attitude right now, is that most everybody had to fight against their director of missions to bring about the conservative resurgence more locally. And I think still a lot of our guys are very concerned with the level of power and authority that the average associational missionary had during that time. Now we're looking at him, and I'm saying, yeah, well, that guy was trying to conserve something. I wish I had some associational missionaries who would conserve something, just the right thing now. So they were fulfilling the role they understood they had. They were just defending the wrong thing. And we need that. We need somebody who helps to identify what is Southern Baptist space? What are those ground rules for cooperative relationship? Being in Montana, I'm not seeing where we have a problem right now with association of missionaries or directors of missions who are creating problems that you need to maybe create some kind of a parallel structure to address. So maybe Dr. Richards can speak to that part.
Yes. Coming to Texas, from being a director of missions, I had a great affinity toward the association and wanted to have a working relationship with the associations when our convention was started. And now, after 20 years having a Texocentric worldview, I have to couch much of what I'm going to respond in that worldview. There are 115 associations in Texas. There are 84 DOMs. And I once told another state exec, I said, I have about 20 DOMs who love me, 20 who hate me, and 40 who are so ambivalent they could care less. He said, well, that's about the ratio in my state convention too, so don't feel so badly. But seriously, what we have found over the 20 years is that some associations have become more and more conservative and affirm the BF&M 2000 and work very closely with us, and some have been entrenched and even recalcitrant, and we even have a handful who do not even recognize us as a state convention to work with us at any level. And so we still have those at either end of the spectrum, and the ones in the middle are trying to walk a tightrope because they have churches in both conventions. So that provides a great difficulty. Some of the more excitable brethren started associations in Texas where about 5 new associations sprang up. But because of the small number of SBTC churches in some areas, and that's usually where they spring up because the predominance of the churches in the association are not SBTC churches, many of them have not been fully functional associations in any regard. However, we have a couple that have now persevered for 20 years, and they have, at least a couple of them have become fairly functional, and one has actually become what I would say is a true association. So it has taken them that long to get there, but there have been new associations that sprang up. But that was as a result of the churches desiring it. And again, our posture as a state convention staff was not to encourage it, nor to be involved in it. If an association was created, it would have to come from the local churches, and then once they were formed as an association, it would be according to our guidelines whether we recognize them or not. But yes, it did happen, and it's still ongoing in the state of Texas, 30 years since the resurgence, essentially. And we continue to work it out on the local level.
Well, I hope you'll show your appreciation to our panelists today.